Hi, thanks for joining me. I'd like to take you through how I make bread using an overnight process. So the first stage of this is going to be the night before, where we build what's called a starter, basically using flour, water and yeast. And then next morning we're going to build the final dough, and that's going to then be about a 4-hour process and guide you all the way from mixing the dough to actually then shaping, proving and finally baking. But the first step is going to be to take a look at the equipment you need. So I'd just like to give you some details around the kind of key equipment you need really for home baking. And it's kind of laid out in front of you here. Key things being, for example, first of all, a fair sized mixing bowl. And this is one that's got kind of a curved inside, because you're going to need to scrape the dough out from when it gets inside the bowl. So the curved is good. That's for mixing. You've then got scales and here to weigh out the flour, etc. So digital scales that go up to about 5 kilograms are good, and that give you pretty good low resolution down to like 1 gram measurements. You're going to need that because you're going to be measuring not just the flour but also water as well when we come to that stage. Other key things you need are going to be any old shower cap will do. The reason for this is going to be to actually stop the dough drying out. So when the dough's in the bowl, you can put the shower cap over it and stop it drying out. That's quite a useful thing to use. You could use cling film, but this is reusable. Use it numerous times. As far as shaping the bread for the prove and then actually baking it, this is a banneton, which is a cane basket, which again you just keep reusing as you need to. Dust it with flour, and the dough sits in that when it comes to the proving stage. Again, I use the shower cap to keep the dough from drying out. Very nice bit of kit, but again very dangerous if you're not careful with it. It's a razor blade, and it's called a lame or lame, depending on how you pronounce it. But that's basically a razor blade which is used to slash the dough as it goes into the oven. And there's a nice handle just so you obviously don't have to hold the blade itself. Put that back away. Really important things are scrapers. This curved edge scraper is deliberately this shape because it fits into when you're using the bowl. Be able to get the dough out of that bowl. As it tries to stick to the bowl, you want a curved edge to be able to get it up. The other side of it is actually deliberately square as well, so that you can scrape along the work surface when the dough sticks to the work surface, which is going to happen. This is another nice piece of kit which does something similar. Scraping dough off the surface, moving flour around. Really useful bit of kit as well. When it comes to baking, I use a ceramic dome, which is this guy here, which is a nice sort of solid ceramic base, which acts like a plate basically. The dome sits on top, and the bread bakes inside the oven. This actually gets preheated before you actually put the bread into it, and then the bread cooks inside the oven, the actual cloche or dome inside the oven. Just to come back over, key ingredients. We're not going to be getting very fancy for this time. Simple things: flour. So I've got strong white flour, and again, the difference really between strong and plain flour being the amount of gluten and the strength, as the name suggests, that the flour gives to the actual dough. Yeast, just quick dry yeast. There's some, which I keep in the fridge inside this little container. Some salt, any old sort of fine table salt will do, and then a little bit of oil, which we'll see later is used to help handle the dough at some various stages. Other than that, really, all you've got is a couple of spoons, and most important thing of all, these. Most important thing of all for doing no knead bread is your hands. Okay, so we'll start off by making this ferment, the starter of the bread, by measuring out our water first of all. So I've zeroed the scales. Here's my bowl, and I'm going to pour in some water, and I really want to get about 149, that's close enough, 150-ish weight of water, rather than volume. I'm not measuring it using the jug, I'm measuring it using weight, so I get the actual right amount. And then what I'm going to do is actually zero my scales again and actually add 150 grams. So the same amount of flour as I've got water. So here's now the flour going in. And I'm just using my spoon here to get it into the bowl here. Yep, there we go, 150. Really all I need to do now is add a little bit of the magic ingredient, a little bit of yeast, and I'm really using a tiny amount now. And if you watch how much I'm using, it's literally about an eighth or a quarter or something really small amount of the teaspoon there going in. And then it's just a case of mixing this together. There's no salt at this stage, there's no sugar, there's no milk or anything else. As I say, this is not the final dough, this is just a starter, which is going to be the base for the final dough tomorrow. So I don't really care too much about the texture of this. I'm not really too worried about how good it is. I'm not going to be doing any kneading on this small amount. I'm just mixing it in together, just so that the flour, the yeast and the water are kind of combined together. Nothing more than that. And then really, that will be it until tomorrow. So now it's about 7, 8 o'clock at night. This can sit at room temperature until tomorrow morning, and then I'll start to build the final dough. So I'm going to cover this now with my very fashionable shower cap, just to stop it drying out really, and then we'll come back tomorrow and we'll continue. Okay folks, so welcome back. It's now the morning after the night before. We've got our final dough to make, and that involves really taking the fermented starter which we built last night, and that's what we'll work on right now. Okay, so now let's get to work with our fermented starter. Here's the shower cap over the bowl, which you saw previously. And this has now been a good 12 plus hours fermenting overnight, and you can see we've got like a really bubbly kind of sticky dough starter here to work with. This is going to be the base for our final dough. So I'm going to start really with the 3 or 4 rather extra ingredients. Again, more water, more flour, and then a bit more yeast and some salt, which is going to build the final dough. I will probably use a little bit of oil as well, because it's kind of helpful to when you're mixing it with your hands, and also on the work surface a bit later on. So I'm going to start then with adding water to the fermented dough. I've got 235 grams of water here, going to go into the starter. So that's just going to add the extra water we need for the final dough. There's the water. And then also going to have weighed out 425 grams of flour, which is the strong white flour, just on here. To that, I'm actually going to add a little bit of extra yeast and some salt as dry ingredients. So here's the dry yeast, same as I used before, and really, again, just a tiny little bit. You know, I suppose it's about 1/5 or 1/6 of a teaspoon goes in there. Really just a small amount. And then 2 teaspoons of salt. You can use really any kind of granulated salt you want. I'm really using level teaspoons here. One of the things that happens with salt is that if you put too much salt in, it will actually slow down the yeast. And if you put a really huge amount of salt in, you would actually kill the yeast. So just 2 level teaspoons there, and then quickly stirring that round briefly, just to mix that in with the flour. I haven't worried about sieving the flour. There's really no need unless it's kind of clearly kind of forming clumps. And then the next stage, was the fun part, is getting into the dough and mixing that round. So I start really with a spoon, just to kind of combine this in with the water, that starter with the extra water added. And you don't need to make a wonderful job of this, it's really just about starting to get that starter to really absorb some of the water here. And if you wanted to, you could even use a whisk to kind of blend it together, but I don't tend to worry about that too much, and it doesn't tend to add any great value. Just getting the water to absorb into the starter is the key thing here, really. Not doing a great job of really getting it ultra fine or smooth, just getting it to absorb in is fine. Now for the dry ingredients. So here's our flour, extra little bit of yeast and salt, just goes in like that. So now that's pretty much all the ingredients we're going to need for this dough. So I start, again, just folding it in with the spoon. Just gradually kind of mixing in, because you won't get it all to absorb straight away. The thing about flour is it actually resists absorbing all that water in an instant. It takes a while to absorb it. It builds up a kind of, the fact of all the dough is a kind of matrix of that water that's activating the yeast and activating the gluten and in the flour and building the strength. So to start with, you know, you don't get much absorption. You have to kind of really persuade it to join in. You can see it's starting to get lumpy, and it's starting to fight me a little bit as I try and stir it. Some of the flour is still not going into the actual dough, so different parts are at different levels of hydration. This is the point really where I get in with my hands, and you're going to love this part. It's where you get to release all your frustration, all your tension. I'm scraping off any excess dough from that mixing spoon because I'm going to jump in with my hands in a second. So you can see it's nowhere near formed yet. It's just a big shaggy mess. Take a little bit of this oil. You can use any oil really. I tend to use vegetable or just a little bit of light olive oil. And then really put a little bit on your hand. So I'm keeping one hand clean and the other one's going to be the one I use to mix with. So if you're right-handed, you probably want to use your right hand. So leave just a bit of oil on my hands. And this is the fun part. This is where you scrunch it in together. Just really scrunch it in together. So it's quite physical, but you don't need to do it for very long. And you're not going to be I'm not going to aim to get a perfect dough at this stage. This is a multi-stage process. You're kind of just really combining ingredients at this stage. And you can see it's actually starting to pick up the extra parts of dry flour around the bowl. But that is about as far as I want to go right now. See, it's not a finished dough by any means. Nothing like it. Simply because, in actual fact, it still needs time for that water to absorb at the lower level into the flour and to form the dough. The gluten is going to develop naturally, just over time. So I'm cleaning off my hands now because we're going to leave this for about 15-20 minutes and then come back to it and then start to do this kind of shaping and turning and folding process, which is how we actually develop the dough, how we get the nice smooth dough that is what you end up putting into a basket to prove and eventually to bake. So that really, folks, is kind of it for the first 15-20 minutes. I'll put the cover back on this, come back in 15-20 minutes time, and then we'll move forward. That's it for now. Okay, so now it's 20 minutes later. We're going to start to actually develop that dough, which at the moment really is just still a sticky mess of flour, yeast, water, salt. And I'm going to do literally something like about 15 seconds of stretching and turning on the work surface, which I've got here. The clean work surface, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on there, just really to stop the dough sticking to it. There's only two other things that you could consider using really for this process, this sort of kneading process, but I call it turning and stretching. And that's either flour, water or oil. I don't want to use water on the work surface. I don't want to also use flour on the work surface because that would change the ratio of how much of those ingredients is actually in the dough. A little bit of oil is also a great way to stop it sticking to the work surface and also stop it sticking too much to your hands. But ultimately, some of it's going to stick to your hands at some point. The thing is not to worry about that. Sticky dough is good dough. Okay, so let's now get into the stage where we just do the 15-second quick knead. So here's our dough. Take away the shower cap again. We'll use that again. And it's not much different from when we last looked. We're 20 minutes later, but it's still just, that's not very nice. You wouldn't want to use that as a dough for baking with. However, I'm going to do some magic in a few seconds. Take a small bit of oil, literally just a small bit like that. And I've got here, again, useful piece of kit, the scraper, which is going to be able to use to get the dough out of this bowl and to leave it nice and clean so it goes on the work surface for me to knead. What I do need though is to put a little bit of oil kind of on the scraper here, and then the rest really on my hand. So I'll come back to the scraper, spread that oil around a little bit because you're going to put the dough onto this piece of the work surface that's now oiled. So I'm actually getting it on both hands this time because I'm going to need to use both hands as I work it. Now, kind of using that scraper, go right into the edge of the bowl and then start to go under the dough here. And you can see it's nice, and it's not very nice at the moment. It's all sticky and horrible. I can always pick up a little bit more oil from the work surface. Working a little bit faster is also a good thing. It allows you to pick it up, then scoop it up, drop it onto the work surface. You can see kind of how little is left in the bowl there because I've been able to scrape and work around it. Now for the 15 seconds of magic. I can pick up the dough like this at the moment, okay, because of the oil it's not sticking to the work surface. You can also see very stretchable at the moment. Very elastic because the gluten isn't doing much. As I start to turn it, fold it in on itself, stretching and turning, stretching and pushing down and back into the self like this. This is basically a form of kneading. I'm pushing it back in on itself. You can hopefully see that it's starting to go really, really smooth. It's also starting to be a lot less elastic. I can't stretch it much anymore without it tearing. As I stretch it like this, you can just see it starts to tear if I pull too hard. don't really want to break that. So literally, that's it. Take the bowl again, lift it up. You can see from the oil it's a little bit shiny. And then that smooth side goes down into the bowl. Put the shower cap back on. Leave it now for half an hour. So that's it. Half an hour, we'll come back and do the same thing again. Okay, so hopefully now you've also waited about half an hour to come back to the dough and to give it another short stretch and turn process. Come back to our bowl. Nice bit of dough. Now the surface I was using to do the turning and stretching is still the same. I haven't really cleaned up, so I've still got some residual oil, which again I want to pick up on my hands because I'm going to be handling the dough. Take my trusty scraper, and actually you can see that really it's not sticking to the bowl too much at all, not too bad, but I still want to use the same process of scraping, getting under it, lift it up, drop it on the work surface, and then do this short period of just stretching and turning. So again, it's slackened off again. It has slackened off again, but that's fine. That's fine. We're going to develop the strength again. Stretch, back on itself. Turn, back on itself. Stretch, back on itself. Back on itself. The amount I can stretch it, you see, again, is going to reduce as I start to kind of build this dough up again. And again, now it's not stretching as much. Every time I kind of pull at it, you can even see little bubbles here, which is a sign of the fermentation happening. Ultimately, you don't want these kind of big bubbles, but at this step in the process is absolutely fine. That's it. I only did about 15 seconds there. Back in the bowl. And again, now for another half-hour fermentation. When we come back in half an hour's time, it should actually be a fair bit larger as well, and we'll have to handle it a bit more gently. But let's see. I'll see you in half an hour. Okay, so that's been another half hour. Let's come back to the dough. Again, same bit of work surface. I haven't really cleaned up. It's still got a little lighter level of oil on it. Dough's looking nice and shiny, and it's really started to expand a little bit so that you can just about see there's kind of little bits of bubbles and a few little pockets of air sort of starting to develop. And that's just from the small amount of yeast, plus of course the original amount that was in the starter, which has caused it to just continue to develop here and to ferment and to progress. Going to lift it up again. Again, no trouble at all now at this stage of getting it out of the bowl. And then again, just 15 seconds. I'm going to handle it a little bit more gently now because as it's starting to ferment more, it is developing small pockets of air. So I'm handling it fairly gently now, but I'm still stretching, turning, just gently stretching and turning here, gently stretching and turning. Gently lift, stretch, turn. Just a few times here. And then that really will do for another half hour. The next half hour is the final period of the initial fermentation, and then we're going to shape it, put it into the basket, and it'll go into its final proof. But for now, that's it. See you in half an hour. Okay, so now we've had another half hour of fermentation. It's now had roughly 2 hours of initial development, and now's the time where we're going to do final shaping and put it into the banneton, in this case one of these guys, to prove for approximately 2 hours before it gets baked. This final stage is really just to allow fermentation to continue in the final shape of the dough. So we're not going to do any more turning or stretching after this final stage here, and we're going to let the dough just gradually continue to grow before it finally gets baked. So you've really got two options at this stage where we're about to do the final shaping of the dough before it gets baked. And it's either to go free form, which is to use something like this, which is a banneton basket, a proving basket, which we'll cover with, or we'll dust with a kind of coarse flour and put the dough into. Or else you could use a baking tin and you kind of create your standard sandwich loaf shape. Again, you've still got to shape the bread or the dough into that shape before it goes into either of these two options. Today I'm going to actually work with the banneton, as that's going to be the final shape that I want to achieve. So let's get to it. I'll put the tin to one side. I've got some wholemeal flour which I'm going to use here. This wasn't part of the dough, but I'm going to just use a load of it now to kind of coat this basket. Because I mean, of course, I don't want the dough to actually ultimately stick to this proving basket. So I want to coat it, not too heavily, but just really all around it, so that in about 2 hours' time when it comes out of here, it doesn't leave any of the dough behind in the proving basket. So that's prepped now, move that to one side. Now we come to our dough, which has now grown from its initial sort of stages of being kind of very small. You can't see from this stage, but it is actually, it's got development of gas inside it. So the yeast eats away at the flour. Again, there was no sugar, no milk needed to be added. The yeast consumes the flour itself to develop CO2, and you get these, you get the gas forming inside the dough, which is why it grows, and you end up with air bubbles inside your bread. I'm going to get this out of this bowl and shape it on the work surface. Now to do that, I'm actually going to lightly dust part of the work surface here, but not all of it. Don't need to dust all of it. Now I'm going to get some flour on my hands at this stage, and I'm going to keep part of the work surface clean, just to the right here. I'm going to keep this relatively clean of flour because I actually want that to be able to stick to the dough as I shape it. So I'll keep my flour handy. Got my trusty scraper again. Here's the dough. So again, don't be too slow about getting under it, getting around it, and then just lifting it out. Now this top surface then is going to go on to that floury section. Now I can put the scraper aside, put the bowl aside, just to make sure again I've got some flour on my hands. Now as I lift this up now, you see of course that because there's flour on the work surface, it hasn't stuck. At this stage as well, what I want to do in fact is actually just press down and make sure there's no big air bubbles left in the dough. I don't really want any big air bubbles. You can just see there's, like, for example, one just there. And those are not desirable. So you do actually want to just lightly press down to squeeze out any big air bubbles. In the process, you can see it causes them to kind of come to the surface. You can push them out. But now what we're going to do again is similar to what we've been doing. Lift up, fold in, lift and stretch and fold, lift, stretch and fold in, lift, stretch and fold in, lift, stretch and fold in. And yes, there's a little bit of that wholemeal flour going in there as well, which isn't too bad a thing. Not too bad a feeling at all actually. Lift and stretch and fold back in. And I can feel tension developing back into the dough again, just like before in the previous steps where it's kind of developing strength again. Now I'm going to make sure that work surface is fairly clean of flour because I want this to stick. As I turn it over now, that's going to be my upside. That's going to be the side that actually, when we bake it, appears on top. So now what I'm doing, as I shape it now, I'm dragging and pushing against the work surface here. So as I use the kind of my right hand here to kind of push against and get under the dough. The other way to do this is to use a scraper or even one of these guys, nice metal scraper, and again at an angle, push under, and you should feel it kind of grabbing, just catching the dough a little bit. The work surface is also catching it. Again, you can use that or you can use your hand. Probably use your hand to start with to get an idea. And this hand is just supporting it. The work surface is using friction to grab the dough, and you can see it kind of creates a nice ball shape there. Again, I'm pushing under. If we turn the dough over now, you'll see there's kind of a seal. That's the bottom underside of it. Really, I've gone as far as I need to with shaping the dough now. I'm going to lift this up, and this is my top side, so that goes into the proving basket like that. And the side that was where the seal is at the top. Ultimately, this is going to be flipped out the other way around for when we get to baking. But for now, cover it over with your trusty shower cap, and we'll leave it for 2 hours to continue for its final proving stage. Okay, so it's probably getting closer to the time now. We're getting about an hour and a half into the final prove, where in theory this should be close to getting ready to go into the oven. With that in mind, and I can see it's developing nicely. As I push it just gently, I can see it bouncing back fairly well, but it's still got a little way to go before it's finished. What I actually want to do now is get the baking dough into the oven. So I'm going to put the bread to one side. Okay, so to bake the bread, we're going to need to put it into this dome. What I really want though is to get this dough nice and hot. This will go into the oven to preheat for a good half hour. Before then the dough goes into it and it gets baked. To do that then, let's turn the oven on. And this is an electric fan oven. I'm going to stick it on 240, nice and hot. Open up the oven. Put the dough in quite low down, so there's obviously space for it to go. Close the door. Now we'll leave it for half an hour. Right, now I think it's probably time to do some baking. let's get the dough out of the oven. Use oven gloves because it's going to be very hot. And now that's nicely preheated, lift off the lid. Again, everything's really hot. Now come to the dough, which should really be nicely just about ready now. As we look at it, you can just about see if I poke it, it bounces back. If it were overproofed, it wouldn't bounce back. Okay, it wouldn't get any bounce back. It would just leave a dimple, and that's not what you want. So you want it to go in before it's overproofed. Going in, there's like a balance point with this stuff, but essentially going in just before it reaches fully proofed is not a bad thing. There's enough growth in here that it's going to spring nicely as it goes into the oven. So this is the reason we actually dusted the basket now, because we need to get this out. This is then the underside, as I mentioned before. I'm going to tip it into here. That's going to gradually fall out. Just take your time, no rush. And there, it's not perfectly straight, but that's fine. Now for the actual scoring. So you want the dough to, as it expands and grows, the crust will kind of try to form and go solid. You actually want the crust to be able to expand. So I'm slashing here because I want that to be able to open up as the bread expands and cooks. So the lid's going to go back on now, and it's going to go into the oven still at 240 degrees. So again, if I open the oven door, put it back in, the whole thing back in, the dome is going to trap any moisture coming out of the dough, which will help the crust. The base of the dome, which the dough sat on, is going to kick heat into the dough as it just starts to cook, and that's really why you use it. The alternative, if you haven't got a dome, is to use one of these, and it's to preheat this in the oven. So this is a baking stone. You may well have seen them already. Principle's the same though, but the base of that dome is going to do the same thing as this would do if you put this in the oven, which is to kick a lot of heat into the dough when it first goes in. And that's radiant heat, is the kind you want. So it's going to really inject heat straight into the oven. Better than the oven itself. Domestic ovens aren't very good. They don't hold enough heat. This acts like a heat sink, the same way the dome does. And that's how you get decent bread. It's going to bake now for half an hour. And then there's going to be another 10 minutes, but I'm going to actually lift the lid after half an hour, just so we get some extra colour on the crust. But we'll come back half an hour and take a look. Okay. Okay, so it's been half an hour in the oven now, and it's been in the dome all this time. 30 minutes is up. I'd like now to take the dome off, crack the heat down a bit actually, back down to about 200 from 240, and 5 minutes of exposure to the heat. Take a look through the oven door actually briefly before you can see it's kind of relatively pale, but it's risen nicely. We'll come back to it in 5 minutes and then just turn the actual dish around in the case of this oven, because most ovens don't really actually cook very evenly. Therefore, I actually want 10 minutes more of without the lid on, but after 5 minutes I'm going to give it a quick rotation, 5 more minutes and then it'll come out. 5 minutes has passed now, and it's literally just a case of turning the bread around. You can hopefully see it's already starting to go a little bit browner, a little more golden, but I've just turned it around 180 degrees, back in, final 5 minutes and then it'll come out. So the final 5 minutes of baking, over. Here she is, all done. Well, I'm pleased with that colour. You can go darker, but I don't really feel the need to go much darker than that at this point. So the fact that it's risen quite so well in the oven is kind of a result of the base. As I said before, is the stone, that ceramic base, whether it's a baking stone or whether it's a dome like this, it's great to actually kick heat in through the bottom of the dough and cause the dough to rise nicely. So the slashes serve a function as well, not just to make it look pretty, but to help the bread actually expand as it bakes, because the crust tries to form quite early on in the bake, but you want the crust to be able to give and to allow the dough to actually expand as the centre part of the dough also gets the heat and cooks. So this is the reason why we do slashes. It's now done, so we can sort of see that, and you can hear that's kind of nice and solid underneath. Nice colour as well, also quite done. So really all I'm going to do now is let it cool down. It goes onto the rack here, cools down, give it at least an hour, or maybe an hour and a half before you think about cutting into it. Don't cut into it just yet, definitely. Okay, now the bread's had a chance to cool for a bit, let's actually take a look and see what the cron looks like, which is the word we used for the inside of the bread, of course. So there it is, finished product. Nice big sharp serrated knife. You would obviously use a serrated knife for cutting bread. So it's not easy to get a bite on the edge because it's quite a nice crust. So I can cut through and get a look inside. So we can see, you know, the mixture of small air bubbles and medium-sized air bubbles. The thing I really want to avoid is anything much bigger than this. So bigger air bubbles tend to be sort of not good for the bread. But that's nice. You can see the contrast in colour between the kind of the crust, the edge, and the kind of creamy inside of the bread. Nice and cooked. You can see it's all set properly because it bounces back like a sponge. Yep, all good, all done.
So if I do this now, do you need me? When's the next time you'll need me?